Welcome to Casa Fuzetta, the House of Stories, with me, Tara.
And me, Kate. Early in 2024, Condé Nast Traveler named Casa Fuzetta one of the best yoga retreats in the world.
In the first few episodes, we share some of the crazy stories involved in the creation of Casa Fuzetta, which is located in a coastal fishing town in the south of Portugal, a country I'd never been to, knew no one, didn't speak the language, but suddenly found myself responsible for the restoration of 3 derelict buildings.
In the last episode, we ventured outside of Olhão to meet Emma, co-founder of a farm-to-table restaurant concept called Osta, and shared some of the beautiful boutique properties that both Emma and Tara have fallen in love with across Portugal.
We also touched a little on the, certainly to me, unknown history of Portugal. And in this episode, we pick up on that thread with an impromptu recording with my Anglo-Portuguese friend, Paul Azevedo. We touch on the importance of the Algarve to none other than Julius Caesar, how Salazar played both sides against each other during the World Wars, and the devastating and sometimes surprising impact of Portugal's colonisation in southern Africa.
Yes, Paul introduced us to the island of São Tomé, described by some as the Galapagos of Africa, but is currently facing a really horrific existential crisis, as most of the adults have been tempted to leave to come to Portugal and abandon their children to this sort of Lord of the Flies kind of environment, certainly like nothing I've ever heard of.
No, it's truly horrific. This was very much an impromptu recording when we were at lunch in one of our favourite restaurants in Olhão. But that does mean, I'm afraid, that the audio is a little bit patchy in places.
I know, but I hope you agree the hustle and bustle adds layers to the experience and brings to life those delicious clams.
I haven't arrived in Olhão until I've had a whole plate of clams.
I'm absolutely with you there.
All to myself. Not sharing.
No sharing.
No sharing. Let's set the scene. We are having an impromptu recording with a great friend, Paul Azevedo, having lunch in one of our favourite fish restaurants in Olhão. And we're doing this impromptu recording because Paul suddenly started telling us some of the history and stories of families of the Algarve, and also what happened during the Salazar years to sort of the local economies and the tradition, the region, but which are now slowly coming back to life. Paul, let's start again and tell us a little bit, because we were having a chat about. What were we having a chat about, because we're sitting here with a
incredible gastronomy.
Oysters. Oh, we started with, we were talking about oysters, but of course a really classic lunch here is local clams that get picked from the Rio Formosa, lit for 100 metres away, and the prawns fried in garlic, and we've all stopped eating, so we should keep eating before it gets cold. Oodles of garlic, olive oil, lemon, and everything.
And coriander,
and
of course.
coriander. And coriander, but also how we were talking, I don't know how we got onto it, but we were talking about, how Olhão historically was the centre of the fishing industry.
Yeah, it was one of the principal fish canning centres in the world, canned sardines and anchovies and other types of products as well. In fact, during the Great Wars, they supplied a lot of the canned goods for a lot of the troops around.
But they did it, but it goes even back to the time of Julius Caesar. So the Roman army was often, every army marches on its stomach, and all of the anchovy paste was made in Olhão. And I think the Roman ruins have found all of these amphoras. So the sort of Olhão's fishing heritage and wealth goes back to Roman times. It's historic. And in fact, before he was Caesar, he was governor of the Algarve. And he made so much money in Portugal, and he had quite a canny little system where I think he kept a third for himself, a third to his troops, and a third to the local population to keep them on side. He made so much money. That's what funded his campaign to become Caesar.
Really?
When he went back to Rome.
Julius Caesar.
I did not know that. Thank you for that
He knew.
insight.
But yes.
So much. I can tell
during the war, as you say, all the I mean, I'd heard it was 48, just 200 plus canneries were working for their lives here, feeding both sides of the war, to be honest. And so they made an absolute fortune. Because under the Salazar regime, you were saying they literally, the families of the north deliberately
cut
down.
They were more, I guess everybody in those days had to support to an extent, otherwise their survival and their future was dependent on their support for the regime, which was the longest fascist dictatorship in any country ever, 49 years. And during that process there was an active campaign to cripple a lot of the industry of the south, which was predominantly fisheries, fish canning industry, wine production, and cork production. In fact, São Brás, as I was mentioning, was the largest cork producing centre in the world.
And it's funny, I've been to little areas, they're tiny little pockets of
you wouldn't really imagine that it ever had that extent of industry, or Olhão really. You could see that it had an industrial past, but not to that scale. And in fact, a lot of the buildings were old manor houses or palaces or factories with housing. But the government of the fascist dictatorship actively crippled those industries in the south to change the dominance over those industries to the north, especially the Douro region around Porto. So then it became the biggest wine producing region, it became the biggest cork producing region, and the biggest fisheries and fish canning factories have also all moved up there. Consequently, the industry collapsed in the south of the country, the families collapsed, the local economies collapsed, and the communities collapsed, and they reverted to very simplistic, illiterate fishing, farming communities without any great industry. But if you think 50, 60 years ago, 70 years ago at this point, it was in fact a bustling, booming, extremely wealthy, sophisticated and developed place.
And you can tell from the building, and the legacy of the architecture.
Yeah, there was a lot of wealth, you can see that.
Yeah, or for example, at the community itself. Yeah, so like there were all these cooperative clubs. For example, the Recreativa, which is been coming back at last now, sort to be this cultural centre and heartbeat of Olhão, which you go in, suddenly it's like, oh my God, they're literally these old 1930s outdoor cinema, and it's not.
It's a beautiful place.
Which is extraordinary. I did have the opportunity to go, thanks to Tara. We had
I also went to Tara the first time.
Yeah, there you go. Well, it is amazing, isn't it? And fantastic to see it coming back, but also really visionary. It's a kind of magical place, I think.
But they had the equivalent for various sporting clubs, all sorts of different. It must have been an extraordinary time, and then obviously tragic that then it all came to.
Yeah, and then following obviously those moves during the dictatorship, and then the collapse of the dictatorship, the region became extremely poor for centuries, and historically they became extremely poor with very little opportunities for education or career. And Portugal was the most illiterate country in Europe at the time, so that further accentuated this lack of investment and development.
And am I right in thinking that under the Salazar, girls and women weren't allowed to go to school or university, they weren't allowed to own property, they weren't allowed to
so another
business or anything
aspect
like
of the regime, which obviously was not infamous for being as brutal as other fascist regimes were at the time, although they were all friends. Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, they were part of the Axis. Although Portugal sat comfortably on the fence and also had the Americans and the Canadians and the British, and everybody was here as well.
Well, they were all competing because they had amazing mineral wealth. So at the beginning of the war, early on in the war, they discovered, I can't remember now what the particular mineral is.
Possibly uranium.
Well, it was whatever it was needed to make the bombs and the munitions, and it was literally lying on the surface of the earth, and it meant that a lot of farmers stopped farming their land, particularly further north. But to your point, the German, because officially Portugal was neutral, and apparently Salazar was playing the Brits and Americans against the Germans because everybody needed this particular mineral for their factories to make the weaponry. And Salazar went, if you're going to get it, you need to pay in gold. This is where one of the big issues with the Nazi comes in the modern history of Portugal, because they did. The Germans drove the lorries across the Pyrenees into Portugal to deliver, because Salazar he was quite canny because he was a professor of economics at Coimbra University. And
he knew how to play both sides very well.
Yeah.
My dad would say, take your half out of the middle, play one side off.
Yeah.
The other. Anyway.
But yeah, don't have we got onto that. But Portugal does sit on this extraordinary combination of sort of natural resource wealth
And geography. This was also one of the main exit points for a lot of Jews fleeing. So you had, in fact, the Americans, the British, the Germans, the Italians, the Spanish, and the Jews all in the same place. No one could touch anybody, but it was the biggest centre of espionage in Europe, in Lisbon, because everybody was there listening to each other and watching what everybody was doing. And the Germans that were here stationed weren't allowed to do anything whatsoever against anybody, including a lot of the Jewish population that fled Europe, thanks to Portuguese diplomats that were giving out visas, a lot of. And Portugal became a safe haven for everybody, really, at that point.
It's an extraordinary story that actually,
then after the war, they closed the country. After the war, they sort of closed the borders, closed it down. No one sort of came in. There was no foreign influence.
And why?
Because they believed that they could sustain themselves through their empire, which they didn't consider they didn't call an empire, although it was very much an empire, and one of the last European colonial empires, which only ended in 1975. But they called it the ultramar and the extension of Portugal. It's Portugal beyond the seas.
Oh, wow.
And that was an interesting way of describing it.
Mind you, the French do that too. Because I can't remember how they describe their islands. Yeah, but it's outre-mer. So it's the same.
It's a similar concept for sure. And during that period of time, in order to preserve that empire and to preserve the nation as it was, they promoted the sense of Portugal being very much capable of standing on its own, not needing anybody else, no foreign influence, although...
let's make Portugal great again. Exactly. There's a little recurring theme here.
And consequently, they took a lot of their resources from the colonies, which were very wealthy, Angola, Mozambique, these places, lots of mineral wealth, and they reinvested it there, not investing it in Portugal. So Portugal remained extremely poor, extremely backward, and the colonies developed and were very sophisticated, very developed, much more so than Portugal, very liberal in terms of fashion, music, arts, and religion and political, to the point that when Portugal finally gave independence to the colonies, and a lot of the multi-generational white settlers in those colonies returned to Portugal, they were shocked at how backward Portugal was, and that they were literally going back in time and they'd arrived in a very primitive land. Comparatively to Angola and Mozambique and these places, Portugal was very primitive. And the most illiterate nation in Europe. And in the colonies, they were all educated. Even a lot of the indigenous populations were educated.
And is that widely publicized in Portugal now?
It's more known, it's more or spoken about, and obviously part of the history, but one aspect of Portuguese history that is definitely not spoken about enough or is brushed over is Portugal's involvement in the slave trade, which was, we see human trafficking for centuries and millions of people. And that is something which the Portuguese have brushed aside as not really relevant to them, which is not part of current contemporary society, but it definitely had a lasting legacy in the colonies, which lasted until 1975 in several places, one of which
São Tomé
São Tomé and Príncipe,
yeah.
where I do a lot of humanitarian work. And one of the principal issues, in fact, of that territory is that although slavery ended in the 19th century, it in fact continued in essence until 1975. And that was a dirty secret of Portugal which nobody talks about, and which I'm trying to shed a light on at the moment through a documentary film I'm producing over there, to really show the consequence of that independence that they gained in 75. They've still remained economically dependent, and they are one of the poorest nations in the world.
And what were you telling me the other day was for a relatively small population, in a way, this sort of subservience is continuing because they've given these huge number of work visas for people to leave, or for the adults to leave, to come and work in Portugal, because like places in the sort of much more developed countries, they've got a shortage of labour,
Yeah.
and therefore they're wanting,
So
they're going to strip this country, this community that's been through so much, they're going to strip them of all of their adults to come and work in Portugal.
The consequences there have been quite devastating. That's another story altogether. But obviously, because Portugal had such a large empire throughout the world, there are hundreds of millions of people that are in the former Portuguese territories. And Portugal having 11 million people, and hundreds of millions around the world that speak the language, is quite useful for labour when the Portuguese younger generations don't want to do certain jobs. They prefer to emigrate to Switzerland to do those jobs rather than doing them here, which means that there's lots of work in hospitality, restaurants, etc., services which are essential for the economy, because tourism accounts for a very large percentage of the Portuguese economy, but Portuguese don't want to work in that sector. The Portuguese government has made allowances for former colonies to basically flood the country with cheap labour. From Mozambique, Angola, São Tomé and Príncipe, various countries like that. The consequence for São Tomé and Príncipe in particular has been that because of the pandemic, which created a financial recession there and stopped all the tourism, etc., and now the granting of these licenses, these permits for people to be able to emigrate, something like 25% of the population has left the country since January 2023, leaving a really critical situation where it's a very large number, and if you imagine, they have left an equal number of children abandoned behind. In a literal sense of abandonment, you now have a very bizarre sort of context developing, sort of a Lord of the Flies kind of scenario of children roaming forests and beaches alone with no adult supervision or guidance. No education. A lot of the people emigrating are teachers, so a lot of the national schools that you would have had 10 teachers for 400 children, you now have 2 teachers. And this is a huge issue, as you can imagine.
So are the teachers coming to work as teachers in Portugal?
Their qualifications there aren't recognised here, so they can't get to the same kind of positions here that they would have there. So they are generally, as migrant workers, forced into the most menial jobs, either construction, gardening, or cleaning, generally with very few opportunities, very little security in their contracts. One of the big issues that is happening now is that a lot of these people are coming over with an expectation of an opportunity. They arrive 3 days later, they've got nowhere to live, nowhere to work, and no money to survive. So you have a lot of people now living on the streets in a lot of the big cities in Portugal, and it's predominantly the African migrant workers that are struggling the most. It's a very sad situation.
Yes.
Which is another dirty secret, which needs to be more visible so that people can try and make a difference.
So as we have you, do you want to tell us a little bit about, we'll let you eat as well, but do you want to tell us a little bit about your documentary?
Oh yeah.
The documentary that you're, an amazing initiative that I know you're now heading up in terms of this NGO, and the lady who's the founder of it.
Christina.
You'll have to sort of tell us a little bit about
her and the
her vision and what you're hoping to do with the NGO and with the documentary.
For opportunity to discuss it.
There's no such thing as a free lunch. No, but you need to eat.
Yeah.
It's a unique country, and I went there for the first time last year after many years of exploring it and studying and researching about the country. And I had this firm idea that I wanted to go over and take part in humanitarian, environmental work. And so I went on this quest, having reached a certain stage in my life where I was looking for a different path and more stimulating experiences and more real experiences as well. And the moment I arrived in that country, I realized that there was something very unique that would be with me forever. And as I explored the country, I had this sort of vision of creating a small short film, showcase a little bit of what I was seeing. Because in terms of geography and landscape itself, it's very unique. It's considered the African Galapagos in terms of its variety of endemic species on the island. Plants, flowers, giant butterflies, the biggest snails, land snails in the world.
Oh, wow.
And it's also one of the huge.
Like a foot.
Like a small football.
Oh my god!
Probably not good eating.
No, I'm trying to get
They used to be eaten, obviously, because there's quite a lot.
Yeah.
But now, obviously, they're protected species because they're endangered and on the verge of extinction. But it's also one of the biggest sort of giant sanctuaries for them to go and lay their eggs as well. And the waters are very calm and consistently calm in the Bay of Gabon, which is surrounding the island. So it's also a big sanctuary for whales to go and for their breeding season as well, which is quite an interesting context. So from a geography perspective, it's incredibly beautiful, but then you have this humanitarian aspect which has developed, which you have approximately 140,000 children in a population of 170,000 people.
So there's 30,000 adults
Approximately 30,000 adults remaining from 18 upwards. Under 18, 140,000 approximately.
And any idea in that remaining 30,000, when you say 18, is it a pretty even spread, like octogenarian, or is it there's some children and then there's 70 plus, the grandparents?
So there has been a huge exodus of a huge demographic of the population. So age-wise, you have this huge contrast. And you have, in many cases, 15 to 30 children being raised by an elderly relative or auntie or grandparent, etc., generally people who aren't physically able to emigrate anymore. So that then creates another problem, which is because there are so many children to feed and so many chores and tasks and things, and if you live in the countryside, you can have a farm, you can grow things, you can fish. So what tends to happen is once you reach 12, 13, you abandon your education to be able to then support the family. So this continues, this cycle, which continues being repeated and has been for the last 50 years essentially, but it's particularly aggravated in the last couple of years since the pandemic, because all industry collapsed, all tourism collapsed, no one was allowed in, no one was allowed out, and because it's an insular nation, not many people know it was forgotten in time, and poverty is one of the worst in Africa, but people are happy, which is the really incredible thing, which is what this documentary is going to show, is that in the midst of such hardship, everybody's smiling, everybody's laughing, everybody's dancing, everybody's singing. They're super curious, they're really sweet, very naive in many aspects because they don't have a lot of access to information, to technology. So I wanted to really show something which is unique in terms of its geographic context and environment. It has a very interesting history because it was the first sub-Saharan African nation to be colonized by Europeans. In 1471, the Portuguese arrived and started building colonial architecture, from forts to cathedrals, all sorts of things. So you have actually 500 years of incredible and unique architectural heritage. which is quite unique in all of sub-Saharan Africa.
And that it would survive, I would think.
It's all been lost, and most of it being overrun with nature, so you have these beautiful palaces, mansions in mountains, but they're all overgrown, and it's romantic, sad at the same time, but also quite romantic and extremely beautiful, the landscapes. And because it's made up of multiple volcanoes extinct, so you have a lot of geological energy coming out of the planet there. And it's where the equator goes through as well. It's considered the center of the Earth.
Which is fascinating, and not that I know anything about. I'm not a volcanologist.
Yes, I think so.
Sounds about right.
A volcano specialist. But presumably there's, in terms of power and being able to harness power underneath the earth to support industry or people.
So they did have actually hydroelectric power in the 1950s and 60s. So because it's a micronation, a lot of things were tested there. So they had some of the most advanced technology for managing this country. So I can't remember exactly the size of the country, but we're in the Algarve now, and it's a quarter of the size of the Algarve.
Wow.
The whole country.
Oh my God, that's
with more than 200 of these colonial plantations in the States.
And you were saying that, some of the families are still living in the slave quarters.
So that's, again, part of what I would like to show in this documentary, the reality that many people live in. I actually, you can adopt and you can foster, etc. And I'm helping a couple of kids. I haven't fostered or adopted yet, but they're part of my life, shall we say. And I met them through their parents, who were there, working in a place that I was staying. And we developed a very close friendship, and I went to get to know their community. And it was a very shocking reality to find that after centuries, people are still living in the same one-room slave quarters that their ancestors have lived in for multiple generations. And the worst thing is that the conditions are worse now than they were when they still had essentially slavery, because it was clean and it was maintained for the colonizers' benefit.
Yeah.
Now that isn't the case, so infrastructure, sanitation is
It's unthinkable.
is the worst you can imagine. And I've met these two little kids that I've now brought into my life, sitting on the floor of one-room slave quarter where their great-grandparents and so on have lived for multiple generations, with open sewers going past. And it was such a shocking reality that it really impacted me so profoundly that I don't think I'll ever forget it. And that made me want to do something, whatever I could, to try and help. So I went and ran the whole country, which is not very big, so it was easy to do and understand the different NGOs, organizations, the work being done there. And having started with the Children and Youth Foundation, I went through all the others and went back to the Children and Youth Foundation because I realized that in fact they have the largest scope of influence within the country to really make a change
Yeah,
at
and the
educational level, environmental level.
The scale of the kids in terms of the population is...
And it's critical. This is the Children and Youth Foundation of the country, so it covers the country, and we have a critical issue where the country is mostly children with no opportunities for the future. Now the teachers are emigrating, they won't even receive any education. We are doing a very challenging job in trying to actually keep people there, to even be able to give assistance to the children that are abandoned. It's a challenge, definitely, and the idea with this documentary was to create an opportunity to showcase a lot of beauty, a lot of creativity. We work with empowerment through music, arts and culture, and that's one of our main areas of focus. We work a lot with female empowerment as well, empowerment of young girls, because there is a high sexuality and promiscuity culturally within the country, which begins as soon as one reaches adolescence, which then creates a continuous problem of pregnancy, multiple partners, multiple children, multiple partners from the age of 12, 13, 14, that begins. By the time you're 20, you've had 3 or 4 kids from 3 or 4 partners, and then your only dream and aspiration is to emigrate and to leave the kids behind. And then you forget them. And you don't see them for 20, 30 years, and that's normal.
And is there
trauma that's
And it's a
leaving
continuous multi-generational trauma just being repeated and repeated.
It's terrible, and actually becomes a cultural phenomenon in itself, doesn't it? It becomes the culture if it's continued, if it continues.
Yeah.
And disease and sexually transmitted diseases, is that like AIDS, or is it pretty isolated and therefore?
It is to a degree. I found out with time that there is quite a lot of HIV in the Prince Islands, so it's São Tomé and Príncipe. It's an archipelago, 2 main islands. The smaller island does have a high level of HIV, although it seems to be more under control. But the issue really is lack of resources and lack of infrastructure. So there isn't
the kids can't get to the schools.
There isn't medication, there isn't dental care. So one of the biggest campaigns that we're working on at the moment is to provide dental care for children who've never been to a dentist in their life. And unless they brush their teeth in our institution on a daily basis with the toothbrush and toothpaste that we provide, they will never brush their teeth. And this is an issue which we're trying to overcome through education. But then if you give a toothbrush and toothpaste for the child to take home, then the likelihood it will be lost or something.
But also, have they got access to clean water?
And then there isn't access to clean water in their
And there's
communities.
also not the habit and the tradition of doing it. You think, I don't have kids, but sorry, you teaching your kids to brush their teeth consistently and do that.
Oh yeah.
Busy
It's a
young-
challenge.
Yes, it's a
It's a challenge.
In fact, I can vouch for that by the number of times I've had to take my son to the dentist.
I see with my
the sort of-
3
yeah.
Western, half English, half Portuguese nephews that they are,
Yeah,
also
you have to
challenged to
say,
get them
yeah,
to
you
brush
have
their
to,
teeth. They
you
don't want
have
to,
to,
obviously.
yeah, you have to sort of sit.
Yeah, and actually love our teeth.
Yeah.
But oral hygiene is a really huge part of the indication of how physically people are and how well they are overall. Isn't it? So,
But it can affect many other aspects of your body and also your mind. Toothache is painful. If you live with toothache and you get used to it, you can get used to it, but it definitely affects your way of life, your concentration. If you're constantly in this pain or this
Yes, and
discomfort.
then what you can eat, and then what you eat affects your sort of whole. It's a holistic. It's the whole chain as ever.
working on this documentary now, do you have a sort of target date when that's coming out, or you're working through it and then...
So I was due to be over there now working on that. I will be going back on the 20th of January and we will be working for 20 days on the filming, photographing, drones, etc. to capture a little bit of all of this and all the various interviews, to edit and hopefully release by March into smaller episodes so it's easier to digest for the viewer. But this is the objective, to then use this as a marketing and advertising tool for the work that we do, so that we can then raise awareness to then raise funds. And we can't raise funds if we don't have marketing and advertising materials. It's not really how I would like to describe it, but in essence, it is
Well,
essentially...
you have to tell the story. It's no comparison, but I remember when I was working with Jamie in school dinners, we all have bad memories of school food, but it wasn't until you actually saw and heard what was going on in the schools that you just went, oh my God, you have to see it to believe it. And this will be on a whole different scale, and because it's
and that
so
was UK,
extreme.
relatively recently.
That's what I mean, and that's what I'm saying. I don't think anybody will. It's so clear when we've been talking about it that you couldn't believe what you were experiencing.
That's why this film is so important. It's
because
visually,
it's that visual. You've
and
got to see it.
You've got to shine a light on it for anybody to be aware that it's there by the sound of it. It's very isolated and whole. Thank you.
Yeah.
Fantastic view.
Yeah,
Thank you
we
very
can't
much.
wait
I've
to
learned a lot and will definitely be more aware in the future.
Thank you for your interest in the project as well. Hopefully it will inspire others to visit at least and get to know it and get involved somehow.
In the show notes, we've added links to the humanitarian projects Paul is working with. Unfortunately, the timings for the documentary which he mentioned have been delayed for various reasons, but when it has been produced, we'll come back and let you know where and how you can support them.
In our next episodes, I'm flying solo to chat with two of our recent workation guests, Nora and Haruka.
both creatives. Nora is a German interior designer and TV set producer. And Haruka is an artist of Japanese heritage who recently emigrated with her gallerist husband from New York to start a new life in Lisbon.
They both share some insights on why people are drawn to Portugal and to Casa Fuzetta, and they tell us a little bit about what they love about the place and what makes them want to return again and again.
As ever, we'd love to hear what you think of the series. You can find a dedicated email address in the show notes where you can send us your questions. And last but not least, we'd be hugely grateful if you would subscribe to the series and help spread the word, sharing it with your friends and family. Did you know that apparently we only need to get 32 downloads to get into the top 50% of podcasts?
Ooh, come on, we can do that. Download.
Até a próxima, everybody. Till the
Até a próxima.